I'm talking on the theme of is the sun conscious? And as soon as you ask that question, you realise there's a taboo surrounding this subject. The fact that most people throughout most of human history have thought of the sun as conscious is a big black mark against this idea. It's there because the fact that it's believed in traditional societies, including in Europe, that the sun is a conscious being, a god or a goddess, that's taken to mean this must be nothing but primitive superstition, an animistic projection of human emotions onto inanimate objects. The fact that children think the sun's conscious, at least implicitly, and draw it with a smiley face, is another black mark. It just proves that this is a childish way of thinking. So, just to raise the question immediately runs into trouble because of this extremely strong taboo. And this taboo has been in place at least since the 17th century. It primarily dates from the mechanistic revolution in science, which replaced the earlier worldview in Europe, which was that nature was alive, the earth was alive, the stars were animate beings with angelic intelligences, that animals and plants were truly living beings with souls. This view was replaced by the idea of a mechanical universe made of inanimate and unconscious matter. So the sun just became a physical object with a gravitational force, a celestial body, but just a body, no mind, no thought. The idea that matter is unconscious is because it came from Descartes' definition of matter as unconscious. He defined matter as unconscious and separated off consciousness into the realm of spirit, which he defined as immaterial, and the immaterial realm consisted of God, angels, and human minds. But everything else in nature, including human bodies, was mechanical and unconscious. Therefore, the sun and the stars are all unconscious. It's simply a definition. It's not as if it was carefully debated, weighed up by learned men and women, and a decision was made. There was no debate whatever. It was simply proclaimed to be unconscious, and so it's remained ever since in the minds of those who adopt the scientific worldview. Now, interestingly, this very conception of matter as unconscious is running into really big problems now. In the 19th century, there were a lot of people who didn't like this dualism, and they thought having two basic principles was too many, there should be just one. Personally, I think two is too few. I think we need at least three. But the idealists said, well, everything's mind or spirit. There's only one reality, mind or spirit. And the opposing school, the materialists, said there's only one reality, matter. Well, the materialists won out in science, and since the late 19th century, materialism's been the official orthodoxy of science, or at least the implicit orthodoxy. So this materialist view instantly got rid of God and the angels, because if there's no such thing as the realm of spirit, God and the angels vanish with a puff of smoke straight away, and that gets rid of all religion, not just Christianity, but all religions. So it brings about essentially atheistic takeover of science. But it does still leave the problem of human consciousness. If human consciousness is nothing but matter, it's nothing but the activity of the brain. Mental activity is brain activity. And that is the materialist theory of mind. Well, this is where materialism's coming unstuck most spectacularly at the moment, because attempts to dismiss our minds and our consciousness as nothing but the activity of the brain, a position that leaves us no free will, and leaves the very existence of consciousness as problematic, is something that philosophers of mind have been debating now for decades. In the English-speaking world, most philosophers of mind are materialists, and they basically have to try and explain that consciousness doesn't exist, or if it appears to exist, then it's just an illusion. That's called eliminated materialism, and it's one of the dominant schools taught in our universities. But this has become increasingly difficult to sustain as the field of consciousness studies has developed, and people have started investigating more and more about the nature of consciousness. And there's been an interesting move in the last 10 years, an accelerating move, where materialist philosophers of mind are jumping ship. The first to do so was Galen Strawson, a British philosopher of mind, who wrote a key paper called Does Materialism Imply Panpsychism? The idea that psyche or mind at all levels of nature, that mind doesn't just emerge from nowhere in human brains, it emerges because there's already a mind-like activity in the natural realm, even in electrons and atoms. The latest major convert to panpsychism is the American philosopher of mind Thomas Nagel, who wrote a key book 2 years ago which caused a furore in intellectual circles, called Mind and Cosmos. Why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. And he comes out in favour of panpsychism, and also in terms of teleology, the idea that the universe has a purpose, even though he remains an atheist. Now, several eminent neuroscientists themselves, particularly Christoph Koch, who worked with Francis Crick, who was a very hardcore neuroscientist, in the last year have come out for panpsychism. And this is a growing movement now. And it's because the intense problems of materialism are now giving way to this much more interesting way of looking at things. But most of these panpsychists, like Thomas Nagel, leave off just where you'd like them to begin. Having made the case for panpsychism, they sort of stop. But I think it's possible to go further, and I think the reason that we need to do that today is because it's impossible to think of the sun's consciousness just as an isolated entity leaving the whole of the rest of the universe unchanged. It only makes sense to do this in the context of a panpsychist view of nature, or animist view of nature, to use a more traditional term. The most interesting of all the panpsychist philosophers, in my opinion, was Alfred North Whitehead, who in the 1920s started developing his philosophy of organism, seeing the whole universe as an organism itself, and stars as organisms, and planets as organisms, and including Gaia, of course, our own planet, and atoms and molecules and crystals as organisms, as well, of course, as animals and plants. So his organismic or holistic philosophy of nature treated organisms as self-organizing systems with their own goals or purposes. Machines don't have their own goals or purposes. Living organisms, or any organism, does. He then went on to discuss how this might work, and he pointed out that according to quantum theory, matter was no longer just stuff. Matter was a process. An electron is a wave. Everything in quantum theory is made of waves, and waves take time to wave. You can't have a wave at an instant, either in time or in space. So think of waves on the sea. If you take an infinitesimally thin slice of a wave, it's no longer a definable wave with a wavelength. It's just something that's impossible in terms of a wave. And this is the ultimate reason for the uncertainty principle in quantum physics, because you can't localize waves exactly in space or time. They're spread out in both. And because they're spread out in time, it means that every material process, every material thing is a process, and that process has a past and future, because it's spread out in time, and it has a direction in time. And Whitehead used this as a way of approaching the mind-body problem. Normally people think of the mind as the inside and the body as somehow outside and as the external world. People talk of the inner life, the mind's within, using spatial metaphors. But Whitehead thought that the best way of thinking of the relation of mind and body was in time. The mind is the future pole of the organism, the body is the past pole. The future pole is concerned with possible actions. And this is true even of electrons. The Schrödinger wave equation tells us all the possible things an electron could do. And when it interacts with something, there's what some people call the collapse of the wave function. Of all these possibilities, only one is actually realized. That's a measurable, observable fact, but it's immediately in the past. It's now a physical fact. And immediately a whole new set of possibilities open up in a new wave equation. which are in the future, or the virtual future. And when the electron, as it were, decides, or when the wave function collapses to one of these again, you get something in the past, a material, body-like, measurable fact. Now, he thought our minds worked the same way. Our minds are principally concerned with possibilities. Consciousness is an arena of possibility. And the function of our consciousness is to choose among possibilities. We all had many possibilities for this afternoon. We chose to come here and to be here out of all the possible things we could have done. We made that decision. We brought it into actuality by coming here. It's now a measurable fact that we're all in this room. We can be photographed, weighed, measured, etc. And our minds are now opening to new possibilities. Now, our habits are generally unconscious and don't require the consideration of possibilities. Consciousness is about consideration of possibilities on this model. It gives us a way of thinking about consciousness and what it does. Now, Whitehead and Strawson and Nagel mainly discussed the possible consciousness of electrons and atoms, and it's very difficult to get oneself into the world of an electron or atom. And I think the whole of this panpsychist discussion gets much more interesting when we start thinking about big things, not little things. And obviously, given one of the big things that we think about is the entire planet, Gaia. This is the Gaia network, and this is something that's been much discussed in this room and in this group. But we can take it further still to the sun, and then ask the question, is the sun conscious? It's a self-organizing system. It has a highly complex pattern of electromagnetic activity within it and on its surface, much more complex than the electromagnetic activity in our brains. And most people consider the electromagnetic activity within our brains to be the interface between mind and body, however you conceive mind and body. But it's the electromagnetic patterns that are what are important, not so much the chemicals of the neurotransmitters. They affect the electromagnetic patterns. But that's what's of interest. The sun's got plenty of them. So even if we want to think in terms of a physicalist model of consciousness with electromagnetic patterns of activity, it qualifies. So it's certainly conceivable that the sun is conscious. The basis for its activity is measurable. You can actually measure all these changes in the electrical activity on the sun, just as you can measure electrical changes in brains. And if the sun is conscious, then the same argument would apply to the stars. All the stars, they may all be conscious. And if all the stars are conscious, then what about entire galaxies? There's several 100 billion stars in each galaxy, like our own. The entire galaxy has a very energetic and mysterious galactic center. It has arms, spiral arms, through which there are huge plasma currents passing, electrical currents. It has magnetic field lines 1 million light years long. The entire galaxy is a complex electromagnetic system. The galactic center may be like the brain of the galaxy. The stars may be like cells in the body of the galaxy, and there may be a vast galactic mind. And if there's a galactic mind, then there may be minds for clusters of galaxies and ultimately for the entire cosmos. The idea that the entire cosmos has a mind is not, of course, a new idea. We find it in Plotinus with the idea of the world soul, the organizing principle of the entire cosmos, which is, if you're a pantheist, then that is God. If you're a panentheist, if you think God is in nature and nature is in God, then that world soul is within the divine mind, within the divine consciousness. But I'm not going to explore at this stage the theological implications of the view, except to mention that the idea that there are many levels of consciousness beyond the human level is not a new idea. It's a very standard idea in Jewish, Islamic and Christian thought, and also in Hindu thought. The Hindus have the devas, many celestial beings or divine beings between the level of human consciousness and the ultimate divine consciousness. And so do Jews, Christians and Muslims in the form of the angelic hierarchies. There are innumerable angelic beings, however you conceive them, forms of consciousness between the human and the divine. So there's nothing in traditional religions that says only humans are conscious in the entire universe and God may be conscious too, and there's nothing else. The idea that the universe is permeated with all sorts of consciousness is a completely traditional view in all cultures. And when our medieval ancestors looked up at the sky, not only did they see the sky as the abode of God, our Father who art in heaven, was not just a metaphorical phrase. The idea that God dwells in the actual sky was what they meant. And the stars that they were seeing were all thought to be intelligent beings with angelic intelligences. So they were looking up to a living sky full of consciousness. Whereas when people look up today, they think they're just looking at hydrogen bombs up in the sky, obeying the laws of physics. Now, if the sun is conscious, then a number of questions immediately arise, including what does it think about? And I helped organise a small conference in 1997, which we held at Hazelwood House in Devon, over the summer solstice. And we had a group of people there, including cosmologists, physicists, experts on mythology. We had an Indian representative of the form of Satish Kumar, and we had experts on psychology as well. And we met to discuss this question, is the sun conscious? On the summer solstice itself, we went up to watch the sunrise over Dartmoor. So it was combined with an actual connection with the sun. Well, when we were thinking about it, the question arose, well, if the sun's conscious, well, what would it do with its consciousness? What kind of decisions might it make? Well, obviously one group of decisions would concern the entire solar system, which is its extended body. The heliopause, which surrounds the entire solar system, is a bit like the magnetopause, the magnetic envelope that surrounds the Earth. And everything within that is a kind of membrane around the entire solar system. Everything within that is essentially within the electromagnetic field of the sun and utterly under the control of the sun and the solar wind. The solar wind, streams of particles issuing from the sun, permeate the whole solar system. They're streaming through, some of them are streaming through us right now. And fluctuations in solar activity affect the solar wind, and they affect the aurora borealis and the aurora australis, the northern and southern lights. They affect the ionosphere and radio transmissions. If there are coronal mass ejections pointed towards the Earth, huge outpourings of mass, highly accelerated particles, then this can cause power outages and enormous breakdown in our civilization. Luckily, it doesn't happen very often that these get directed towards the Earth. But if the sun's conscious and has control over its body, which any form of consciousness must involve, one of the ways in which it could modulate the entire solar system and indeed life on Earth is by deciding where and when to fire off solar flares and coronal mass ejections. And the sun could, if it wanted to, close down our technologies by a big coronal mass ejection directed towards the Earth, which would cause enormous power outages. We've now set up long-distance transmission systems which are like aerials for these solar pulses and would cause meltdown of transformers and entire power grids to go out. The sun can modulate everything much more subtly, of course, but if it came to sort of knock-out blows, it's quite capable of those. Another thing that the sun might be concerned about is its peer group, the other stars. And we don't know much about interstellar communication or in what way stars communicate with each other or in what way they're modulated by the entire galaxy. But that would be another sphere in which the sun's consciousness would come into play. Now, interestingly, a solar physicist, an astrophysicist, has recently come up with a very similar idea to this. At first I thought I couldn't get anyone in the scientific world to discuss this, and I talked to one of our most eminent astronomers one day, and I was staying with him, and as we were sitting on the lawn reading the Sunday papers, I said to him, have you ever considered the possibility that the sun's conscious? He said, what? I said, the idea that the sun might be conscious. He said, certainly not. And it was very clear that that was the end of the discussion. It was just not on the agenda. Most physicists, I think, even if they entertain the idea in private, don't come out of the closet and talk about it. But this book, published a few weeks ago by Greg Matloff, Starlight, Starbright, Are Stars Conscious, does take this argument a little bit further. Matloff shows that if you look at the way galaxies work, there's a real problem about galactic organization. The stars are not moving in the way they ought to be moving if galaxies were just governed by the known laws of gravity. This was recognized in the 1980s by astronomers and cosmologists. And in order to deal with this problem, some of them said, well, maybe the laws of gravitation are wrong and we need a modified law of gravitation. But the others said, no, there's nothing wrong with the laws of nature as we understand them. In order to explain why the stars are moving too fast around the galactic center and why galaxies are attracting each other too much, according to the amount of matter within them, there must be more matter within them than we know. And because it's not observable in any way, they called it dark matter. So how much dark matter is there in the galaxies? Well, there's just the right amount to make the equations balance. You titrate in dark matter till you've got just the right amount, and the equations work perfectly. You say, well, no, we've fixed the problem. Then if you get a bulge on a galaxy where there ought not to be one, then obviously there must be more dark matter there that's causing the bulge. So you titrate in topical application of dark matter to explain the bulge. It all works perfectly. The only thing is there's no independent evidence for the existence of dark matter. It's an entirely hypothetical solution to this generally agreed problem that galaxies aren't behaving as they ought to if our understanding of gravitation is correct, without the arbitrary addition of ad hoc amounts of dark matter. Having added all the dark matter into the universe, it meant it had more matter altogether than it should have done, and that meant it should be slowing down in its expansion. But when it was discovered in 1999 that it was in fact speeding up, that led to another problem, easily solved by the introduction of dark energy. And how much dark energy? Just the right amount to explain the observed facts. The total amount of dark matter and dark energy is now 96% of physical reality. And that means, literally, that 96% of physical reality is utterly unknown to us. It's entirely hypothetical, and it may be things are organized quite differently. Well, one thing that Matloff does in his book, Are Stars Conscious, is look at the way that stars could actually affect their own motion by squirting out jets of matter in one direction rather than another. You see, every time there's a coronal mass ejection or an ejection of matter from a star, then just like in a jet engine, there's a reaction force on the star which would affect its orbit. And what he calls the volitional star hypothesis, he calculates how much matter would need to be shot out in which direction. It's not very much, it would be a fairly small amount that could actually allow stars to adjust their own movements within galaxies and follow trajectories within galaxies that would help remove the need for dark matter, for which there's no independent evidence. So people who, basically it boils down to this, a choice between volitional stars or hypothetical dark matter. It's not as if there's a simple, common sense, hard fact answer. There isn't. And of the two, personally, I prefer volitional stars. So if the sun is conscious, then its consciousness must be about possibilities, possible actions, choosing among possible actions. And what we don't know, and is hard to imagine exactly what the answer would be, is what level of consciousness the sun has. Are we talking about something sort of a little better than a plant? Or are we talking a kind of supermind that knows everything that's going on within the solar system, including what we're doing in this room right now. We're all within the electromagnetic field of the sun, which is a kind of sensor for the sun. And when you think of the sense organs of the sun, the sense organs are most likely to be electromagnetic fields. The entire solar system is within the electromagnetic field of the sun. This room is within the field. When it's light, of course, it's obvious where it's in sunlight. Even at night, we're still within the electromagnetic field of the sun. The electrical changes in our brains and bodies are within the electromagnetic field of the sun. It's the ambient field in which everything on Earth happens. How fine-grained the sun's perception of what these changes are, we don't know. But I like the idea of the field being the sense organ of the sun. I don't claim that this is an original idea. It's one of Isaac Newton's most stimulating ideas for me is in his speculations, which he published towards the end of his life, in the Queries at the end of the second edition of Optics. He published a series of queries, unsolved problems, issues he was wrestling with, but which he hadn't been able to solve. And this was his last testament, as it were, the unsolved problems on Newton's mind. And it's very fascinating. Most scientists don't do this. I think more should do. Say, what are the problems they're really preoccupied with? They could write them down towards the end of their life, as Newton did. It's not many pages long. But one of them is he's thinking about how God can know what's going on. Newton was a Christian, of course, a Unitarian rather than a Trinitarian. But he spent quite a lot of time trying to think how God could be omniscient. He didn't think that it was satisfactory to just say, God just knows everything. So how does God know everything? By what means does God know everything that's happening in the universe? And he came up with the idea that the gravitational field, what we now call the gravitational field, or the force of gravity, that which was the ground of gravity, was God's sense organ. The space, actually absolute space itself, which was, in Einstein's theory, is the gravitational field. For Newton, the gravitational forces work through absolute space, but absolute space was that within which all things happened. And absolute space was God's sense organ. And that God therefore knew where everything was and what everything was doing, because it was all happening within his sense organ. Everything was within God. Well, if we take that in terms of Einstein's theory of the gravitational field, then that would be one form of sense organ of the divine of the whole cosmos. And we'd also have these local sources. The sun itself will feel where all the bodies in the solar system are through the tides caused by planetary motions, because it's just as the moon causes tides on Earth, so the planets all cause tides on the sun. So it has a direct gravitational sensing of the field, of the positions of the planetary bodies. It may also know, as I said, in much finer detail what's happening through the electromagnetic field, sensing what's going on. Now, there's then the question of, can we communicate with the sun? Certainly many people worship the sun and make offerings and prayers towards the sun, either in its own right or as a channel of God's light. In the practice of yoga, there's a practice called Surya Namaskar, salutation to the sun. It's a yoga exercise many people do. I do it myself. I've done it every day for 40 years. It's one reason I'm interested in the sun, because I do this salutation every morning. It's an Indian form of yoga. Also, one of the great Hindu mantras, well, probably one of the most popular of all Hindu mantras, is the Gayatri mantra, which is an invocation to the divine light of the sun to illuminate our meditation. So there are already these practices, and I think if I were running a research program on this, I'd do a cross-cultural study to start with, to find out what people in different cultures believe. Not only they say to the sun, but the sun might be saying to them. Do other cultures where shamans claim to be communicating with the sun? If so, how do they do it and what do they find out? Other ways in which we could interact consciously with the sun. My ideas on this are slightly shaped by a book of Fred Hoyle's I read a long time ago. One of his less-known books are The Black Cloud. How many people have read The Black Cloud? Yeah. Have you, Chris? Yeah. No one. Well, that's surprising. I mean, it's a terribly interesting book, and it's set after the war with a number of boffins in something a bit like Bletchley Park in a country house. And they start getting anomalous signals, radio astronomy signals, and it turns out there's a large black plasma cloud coming towards the Earth, and it's giving all sorts of anomalous signals. And they then start sending out beams to probe it, and they start getting what seem to be responses. And then the idea grows that this plasma cloud, through the electrical currents within it, may actually be conscious, and that they're interacting with this conscious cloud that then sort of comes very close to the Earth, sort of blocks out light, and they manage to persuade it to go away. But it's a fascinating book, because Fred Hoyle was one of our most important astronomers, and he applied his fertile imagination to the idea of a form of consciousness that's not embedded in a brain. We need to get beyond this cerebrocentric view of consciousness if we're going to start thinking panpsychically or animistically. We've got too fixated on brains, I think. And The Black Cloud is a wonderful corrective to that thinking. For me, it was a great liberation to read his book. Now, I just finally want to say a couple more points, because I very rarely talk on this subject, because of the taboo. This is only, I think, the third time I've ever spoken on this topic. And on the previous two occasions, one of them was in the summer in a sort of alternative community in Canada, a place called Hollyhock on Courtesan in British Columbia. When I spoke there, the previous one was at Clare College, the Dilettante Society at my own college, and James's College in Cambridge. My son, when he was an undergraduate there, persuaded me to give a talk on this subject to the Clare Dilettantes. Normally it's a small group, but this one, it turned out about half the fellows and about 60 undergraduates came. I had to move it to a bigger room. And only because my son persuaded me would I have spoken out publicly about this. But anyway, the same thing happened there, and in this very different commune. In Clare College, there were quite a lot of comments about, well, how do you know what consciousness is, etc., etc. But basically, in British Columbia, the first question that came up, it was about the 10th question in Cambridge, is, what about the moon? And yes, well, I ran into terrible problems. There was debates going on Courtesan for days after, and I was assailed everywhere I went, the village store and so on, by people. There's intense debates, because what I said then, I thought a bit more, so I'll say something differently now, but what I said then was that the moon was probably not conscious, because consciousness depends on the possibility of choice, decisions for possible actions. And the moon doesn't have many possible actions. I mean, it sits there in the sky, it's impacted by craters, it's kind of passively hit by meteors and things. But it doesn't have an atmosphere, there's not much it can do. So I thought the moon probably had very little in the way of consciousness, if anything. This really upset the feminists. So I had a lot of problems with women on the island the next week. It didn't lead to such an upset at Clare College, Cambridge, but I've been thinking about it since then, and I think that actually we have to see that the moon is really part of the Earth. It originated as part of the Earth. The generally accepted theory, as far as I know, is that an impact on the Earth by a very large celestial body, asteroid, caused a huge chunk of matter to separate off, and that coalesced and became the moon. So it's an ejector of the Earth. It can coalescence of ejected matter from the Earth. And its position in relation to the Earth and its interaction with the Earth through the tides makes it part of Gaian consciousness, and it's not a kind of independent. I don't think it has much consciousness of its own, but I think it has to be seen as part of the consciousness of Gaia. Now, that's another question, and we're not discussing that today. The consciousness of the Earth, it has been discussed here before. But finally, one could apply the same criteria to the other planets. Insofar as the planets have an autonomous set of activities that could go one way or another, in Jupiter there's swirling vortices, there's in Venus there's huge clouds, gaseous clouds moving around. There are all sorts of possibilities for an organising activity of consciousness on other planets. The Moon just has very few compared with most other celestial bodies in our solar system. One of the really big questions then is just how, if the Sun's conscious, then is it got a relatively small mind of limited scope, or is it a vastly greater mind than ours? And how might we communicate with it? Those are very much open questions. Obviously, I can't prove that the Sun's conscious, but you can't prove that it's not. So it is very much an open question. I can't even prove that any one of you is conscious. I can simply infer it. The only consciousness I can know about directly is my own, and my own through participation in other minds. This is an open question. To what degree it's scientifically testable, I don't know. But the idea that the Sun's not conscious is not scientifically testable either. So I think this is a particularly interesting question. It does throw into sharp relief the kinds of questions that arise as we move into post-materialist, animistic or panpsychist view of nature.